Have you ever realized that the harder you've tried to hold on to someone, the faster they seem to slip away? I'm not talking about love as an idea. I'm talking about that quiet moment almost every man experiences without noticing it. The moment when one person slowly became the center of your emotional world. Not overnight, not through one decision, little by little, until one day you looked around and realized your happiness depended almost entirely on how they looked at you, spoke to you, or responded to you. And something changed, not just inside them, inside you. The way you carried yourself shifted. The way they responded to you shifted with it. There's a truth about attraction, respect, and human behavior that most people never learn. Not because it's hidden, because it's uncomfortable. Accepting it means admitting that many of the things you've been taught about love, the things you've practiced for years, may have quietly produced the opposite of what you wanted. Not because you were weak, not because your intentions were wrong, simply because no one ever explained the psychology beneath them. From an early age, we're told that love means sacrifice, that devotion is measured by availability, that putting someone else's needs before your own proves commitment, that saying yes more often than no makes you a better partner. So you do exactly that. You become more accommodating, more patient, more forgiving. You slowly move yourself to the background so someone else can stay in the foreground. Maybe as you're listening right now, one particular memory has already surfaced. One relationship, one woman, one familiar pattern that keeps showing up in different forms no matter how much time passes. At some point you probably wondered, why does this always happen to me? The answer is, it usually isn't random. It's a pattern, a psychological pattern that's been quietly influencing human relationships for centuries. Today we're going to take it apart piece by piece. More than 500 years ago, a man named Niccolò Machiavelli wrote a book that history remembers as a guide for rulers and political leaders. Most people stopped reading there. They assumed it was only about kings, power, governments, and control. But anyone who looks beneath the surface notices something else. Machiavelli wasn't simply describing politics. He was describing people. He was studying what human beings actually respond to, not what they claim they respond to. He stripped away comforting stories. He ignored idealized versions of human nature. Instead, he focused on behavior exactly as it appears when reputation, desire, fear, ambition, and emotion collide. That's why his observations still feel unsettling centuries later. Because people have changed remarkably little. What I'm sharing today isn't about turning relationships into power games. It isn't about becoming manipulative. And it certainly isn't about treating people badly. It's about understanding human psychology without pretending reality works differently than it does. Because once you understand these mechanisms, you stop accidentally sabotaging yourself. You stop chasing respect in ways that quietly destroy it. You stop confusing sacrifice with value. If you're willing to hear something that challenges what you've always believed, stay with me. Because this isn't another speech about simply loving yourself more. It's a deeper examination of why attraction fades, why respect quietly disappears, why people often drift away from those who care about them the most, and what has to change inside you before those patterns can finally stop repeating. Let's begin with the mistake almost every man makes at least once, maybe several times. At some point, someone became so important to you that you slowly stopped being important to yourself. The dangerous part is that it never happens all at once. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides, today I'll abandon myself. It happens through tiny decisions. One compromise, one excuse, one moment where you stay silent instead of saying what you really think. One occasion where you accept behavior that doesn't sit right with you. One boundary you quietly erase because you're afraid creating conflict might cost you the relationship. None of those moments feels significant by itself. Together, they completely reshape the way another person experiences you. You believe you're communicating something beautiful. I'm loyal. I care. I'll always be here. But that's not always the message being received. Often, the message arriving on the other side sounds very different. It quietly says, my own needs aren't important. I'll abandon myself before I risk losing you. I don't believe I deserve better treatment. That's a message you never intended to send. But human beings rarely respond to intentions. They respond to patterns. And psychology has been examining those patterns for decades. Researchers have repeatedly found something deeply counterintuitive about human attraction. The very behaviors people believe will make someone feel more loved can slowly reduce the respect that relationship depends on. Not because kindness is unattractive, not because generosity is wrong, but because self-abandonment communicates something entirely different from love. And once that pattern begins, everything else slowly starts changing with it. The next idea is one of the hardest to accept because it feels completely backwards. Psychologists sometimes describe it as the paradox of emotional need. And once you understand it, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. It works like this. The more your emotional stability depends on one specific person, the more obvious that dependence becomes. And the more obvious it becomes, the less attractive it often feels to the other person. That sounds harsh, but it isn't about cruelty. It isn't because people enjoy rejecting those who love them. It's because the human nervous system reacts to emotional pressure in a very predictable way. When another person's happiness begins resting entirely on our shoulders, something inside us instinctively looks for space. Not because we hate them, because we feel responsible for something no one can realistically carry. Think back to your own life. Maybe someone once became overly attached to you. They needed constant reassurance. Every delayed reply became a problem. Every change in your mood became something they had to analyze. Their entire emotional world seemed to rise and fall based on your attention. How did that make you feel? Did it increase your attraction? Or did it quietly create pressure? A feeling that you couldn't breathe without disappointing them? Most people recognize that feeling immediately. Now ask yourself something much harder. Have you ever become that person for someone else? Maybe not intentionally. Maybe it happened gradually. You loved deeply. You prioritized them. You wanted them to know how much they mattered. Without realizing it, your own life slowly began revolving around theirs. And the painful irony is that the more you tried to prove your love, the less secure the relationship often became. Machiavelli understood something remarkably similar. He observed that people judge far more by appearances than by intentions. In other words, what people experience from you usually carries more weight than what you secretly mean. Your intentions might be completely sincere, but if what you consistently project is emotional dependence, that's what people respond to. They don't hear, "I care about you." They often perceive, "I don't believe I'll be okay without you." And those are two completely different messages. The first creates warmth. The second quietly transfers emotional responsibility. That's why this conversation has nothing to do with pretending not to care. It has nothing to do with acting distant, ignoring messages, or playing psychological games. Those behaviors aren't confidence. They're performance. Eventually, every performance falls apart. Real confidence comes from something much deeper. It comes from building a life that already feels meaningful before another person enters it. A man who genuinely enjoys his own life doesn't have to manufacture independence. He already has it. He has friendships that matter, work that challenges him, goals that excite him, interests that continue whether someone chooses him or not. Because of that, he approaches relationships from desire, not dependence. There's an enormous difference between genuinely not needing validation and pretending not to need it. One comes from inner stability. The other comes from fear disguised as confidence. People sense that difference more quickly than most realize. Which brings us to something even more important: respect. Most people misunderstand where respect actually comes from. They believe respect is earned through generosity, through patience, through endless understanding, through always being the bigger person. But respect rarely grows from endless accommodation. It grows from consistency, from internal alignment. People naturally respect someone whose actions clearly match their values, someone who knows where their limits are, and doesn't abandon them simply to avoid disappointing others. Respect isn't something you request. It isn't something someone gives you as a reward. It's a response, a psychological response to clarity. When another person sees that your standards remain steady, even when maintaining them costs you something, they begin understanding who you are. That predictability creates trust, and trust creates respect. Researchers studying long-term relationships have found something fascinating. People who communicate healthy boundaries clearly, even when those conversations create temporary discomfort, are consistently viewed as more trustworthy, more emotionally stable, and perhaps surprisingly, more attractive. Why? Because boundaries communicate identity. They quietly say, "This is who I am. This is how I choose to live. This is what I can accept. And this is what I can't." That kind of clarity feels incredibly rare. Now think honestly about your own experiences. How many times have you ignored your instincts because you feared someone might leave? How many times did you agree with something you didn't actually agree with? How many times did you stay silent because speaking honestly felt risky? And after making those sacrifices, what happened? Did the relationship suddenly become healthier? Did the other person appreciate you more? Or did they slowly begin expecting more compromises, simply because every previous compromise had been accepted without consequence? Machiavelli wrote one of history's most controversial lines: "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." That sentence has been misunderstood for centuries. Many interpret it as permission to dominate people. That's not the deeper lesson. Read in context. He's describing consequences. He's explaining that people naturally respect situations where actions carry weight. Applied to relationships, the idea becomes surprisingly simple. If every line can be crossed, if every broken promise is forgiven immediately, if every act of disrespect receives the same unconditional acceptance, then nothing actually costs the other person anything. And when behavior has no consequences, respect quietly erodes. Not because people are evil, because human beings naturally stop protecting what they believe can never be lost. That's basic psychology. Scarcity creates value. Abundance often creates familiarity. And familiarity, when completely unconditional, can quietly become indifference. Your attention, your time, your emotional investment. These are incredibly valuable things, but only when they're given intentionally, not automatically, not endlessly, not at the expense of yourself. There comes a moment in almost every man's life when everything he's built emotionally seems to collapse overnight. Maybe she leaves. Maybe she slowly becomes distant. Maybe nothing dramatic happens at all. She simply stops looking at you the way she once did. And suddenly your entire emotional world begins to revolve around one question: how do I get her back? That's the instinct. The mind immediately searches for solutions. Send another message. Explain yourself better. Show her you've changed. Fight harder. Love harder. But here's the uncomfortable reality. The brain in emotional panic almost always recommends the exact behavior that pushes the other person even further away. Why? Because fear narrows perception. When you're afraid of losing someone, you stop acting from who you are. You start acting from what you think might stop them from leaving. And those are two completely different identities. One creates attraction. The other creates emotional pressure. The harder you chase certainty, the more uncertain you become. That's why the strongest move is rarely the fastest one. Sometimes the strongest move is stopping long enough to ask a much deeper question. Not, how do I make her come back? But, why did losing one person make me feel like I lost myself? Because that question changes everything. It moves your attention away from controlling another person's choices and back toward understanding your own psychology. Maybe your happiness became too dependent on one relationship. Maybe your confidence slowly became tied to her approval. Maybe without realizing it, you stopped building your own life because maintaining the relationship became your entire mission. And when the relationship shook, everything else collapsed with it. That's not because you loved too deeply. It's because somewhere along the way, your identity became too small. This is where Machiavelli offers one of his most misunderstood lessons. People often think power comes from controlling others, but real power begins with governing yourself. A man who cannot manage his own emotions, cannot manage his decisions, a man who cannot tolerate discomfort, becomes predictable, and predictable people are easy to manipulate, because all someone has to do is threaten the thing you depend on most. That's why emotional independence isn't about becoming cold. It's about making sure your emotional stability doesn't depend on circumstances outside your control. You can love someone deeply without making them responsible for your peace. You can desire someone without needing them to validate your worth. You can miss someone without abandoning yourself trying to keep them. That's emotional maturity. Purpose plays a much bigger role in this than most people realize. Look closely at the men who remain emotionally grounded during difficult relationships. They usually have something outside the relationship pulling them forward. A mission, a business, a craft, a vision, a responsibility larger than romance. That doesn't mean they care less about love. It means love exists inside an already meaningful life, not instead of one. Think about it from a psychological perspective. For thousands of years, humans naturally trusted people who demonstrated direction. Someone who knew where they were going. Someone capable of making decisions. Someone who could remain calm under uncertainty. Those signals still affect attraction today. Not because people consciously think, he has goals, therefore he's attractive, but because direction communicates stability, and stability creates trust. When your life has genuine momentum, you stop trying to squeeze your entire identity out of one relationship. You become someone who chooses love, instead of someone searching for rescue. Another idea that creates endless confusion is emotional control. Many people think emotional strength means suppressing feelings, pretending nothing bothers you, acting indifferent, staying expressionless. But that's not strength. That's avoidance. Real emotional control means feeling everything, without allowing every feeling to become an action. You can feel jealousy, without accusing. You can feel rejection, without begging. You can feel anger, without exploding. You can feel disappointment, without abandoning your values. Emotions aren't the enemy. Impulses are. There's a huge difference. Neuroscience repeatedly shows that emotional regulation works like any other skill. It improves through repetition, not during life's biggest crises, but during everyday discomfort. Every time you resist sending the emotional text immediately, you're training. Every time you pause before reacting, you're training. Every time you choose clarity instead of emotional impulse, you're strengthening the part of yourself that eventually becomes emotional stability. These moments seem insignificant. They're not. They're the repetitions that quietly build character. Then there's validation. Every human being wants it. We all want to feel appreciated, seen, wanted. That isn't weakness. It's human nature. The problem begins when one person's opinion becomes the entire foundation of your self-worth. Suddenly, your mood depends on their mood. If they reply quickly, you feel valuable. If they pull away, you question yourself. Your confidence rises and falls based on someone else's emotional weather. That's no longer love. That's dependence. Healthy love looks different. Healthy love happens between two complete people. Two lives that already have meaning independently. Two people who choose each other, not because they cannot survive apart, but because life becomes richer together. That's partnership. Dependency feels intense. Healthy love feels peaceful. And those are not the same thing. Boundaries become incredibly important here. Most people misunderstand boundaries completely. A boundary isn't an ultimatum. It isn't punishment. It isn't saying, do this or else. A boundary is simply clarity. It's deciding what behaviors belong in your life and which ones don't. That's it. You're not controlling another person. You're controlling your own participation. There's a profound psychological difference. Threats attempt to force change. Boundaries simply communicate consequences. If respect disappears, you leave. If dishonesty continues, you leave. Not to manipulate, because that's the standard you've chosen for your own life. Ironically, people often respect boundaries more than endless forgiveness, because boundaries communicate something simple. I value my own life enough to protect it. And self-respect is magnetic, not because it's aggressive, because it's believable. Many men also confuse loneliness with being alone. They're not the same experience. You can sit beside someone every night and still feel completely alone. You can spend a weekend by yourself and feel deeply fulfilled. Loneliness isn't created by empty rooms. It's created by disconnection from yourself. The stronger your relationship with your own purpose, your own values, your own identity, the less terrifying solitude becomes. And once solitude stops frightening you, relationships stop becoming emotional survival. They become genuine choices. That's freedom. So here's one question worth asking yourself honestly. Are you staying because you truly choose this relationship, or because you're afraid of what life looks like without it? Those answers sound similar. They're worlds apart. Fear keeps people trapped long after love has disappeared. Psychologists even have a name for it: the sunk cost effect. We continue investing because we've already invested so much. Years, energy, emotion, time. But past investment doesn't guarantee future happiness. The only question that matters is, what kind of future am I choosing from this moment forward? Everything eventually returns to one foundation: self-respect. Most people think self-respect comes after success, after money, after confidence, after recognition. But the opposite is usually true. Self-respect comes first. It begins in tiny daily decisions: how you speak to yourself, what you tolerate, how you spend your time, who you allow into your life. Every decision quietly teaches your brain what you believe you're worth. And eventually, other people begin responding to that belief. Not because the world suddenly changed, because you changed the standard you communicate. That's the deepest lesson hidden beneath Machiavelli's work. It was never really about manipulating people. It was about mastering yourself. The man who cannot govern his own emotions, cannot build lasting relationships, cannot lead, cannot remain steady when life becomes uncertain. Everything begins with self-mastery, not perfection, not pretending, not becoming emotionally unavailable. Simply becoming someone whose peace doesn't disappear every time circumstances change. Because attraction isn't created by becoming less emotional. It isn't created by pretending you don't care. Real attraction grows when someone meets a person who already knows who they are. Someone who can love fully, without disappearing inside that love. Someone who chooses connection, without abandoning themselves to keep it. That's the kind of strength people instinctively trust. And that's the kind of confidence no rejection can take away. Because it was never built on someone else's approval. It was built from within. And that's a freedom no one can ever remove. So after everything we've explored, one truth keeps revealing itself over and over again. The greatest mistake most men make isn't loving too much. It isn't being too kind. It isn't caring too deeply. The real mistake is slowly abandoning themselves in the process of loving someone else. It happens so quietly that most people never even notice it. One compromise, one ignored boundary, one moment where you silence your own needs, because keeping the relationship feels more important than protecting your own identity. None of those moments seem significant on their own, but over time they add up. And eventually you wake up realizing you've built your entire emotional world around another person's choices. That's the point where attraction begins to disappear. Not because you became less valuable, but because you stopped treating yourself like someone valuable. And people almost always respond to the standard you set for yourself. Machiavelli's greatest lesson was never about controlling other people. It was about understanding human nature honestly enough to stop lying to yourself. He understood something uncomfortable. People don't simply respond to your words. They respond to what your behavior consistently communicates. You can tell someone you're confident, but if every decision comes from fear of losing them, they'll feel that fear long before they believe your words. You can tell someone you respect yourself, but if you repeatedly tolerate disrespect, your actions tell a completely different story. Behavior always speaks louder than explanation. Always. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally distant. It doesn't mean pretending not to care. It doesn't mean playing games or calculating every interaction. Those strategies eventually collapse because they aren't built on anything real. Real confidence doesn't need performance. Real strength doesn't require pretending. Real self-respect doesn't announce itself. It quietly appears in the decisions you make every single day, the conversations you're willing to have, the standards you're willing to protect, the opportunities you're willing to walk away from, the peace you're no longer willing to sacrifice. Those choices shape your identity far more than any motivational speech ever could. The irony is that the moment you stop making your entire life about earning someone else's approval, you become far more attractive to everyone around you. Not because you've learned a psychological trick, because you've finally become emotionally free. There's a different energy in someone who no longer negotiates their worth. Someone who enjoys love without depending on it. Someone who can lose a relationship without losing themselves. That kind of presence cannot be faked. People feel it immediately. They may not know exactly why, but they trust it. They respect it. And often, they're drawn toward it. So perhaps the real question isn't, how do I make someone value me? Maybe the better question is, have I been valuing myself enough to expect healthy love in return? Because the relationships you attract are often reflections of the standards you consistently live by. Raise those standards, and your relationships begin to change naturally. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily. First, your decisions change, then your habits, then your confidence, and finally, the people you allow into your life. At the end of the day, love was never supposed to become your identity. It's supposed to become part of an identity you've already built. A meaningful life doesn't begin with finding the perfect partner. It begins with becoming someone who can stand firmly on their own 2 feet. Someone whose direction exists whether they're single or committed. Someone whose peace isn't constantly borrowed from another person's attention. That's the kind of person who creates healthy relationships. Not because they're perfect, but because they arrive whole. If there's one idea worth remembering after this entire conversation, let it be this. Never build your life around the fear of losing someone. Build your life around becoming someone you never want to lose yourself. Because once you develop that kind of self-respect, you stop chasing validation. You stop negotiating your values. You stop confusing emotional dependence with love. And you begin attracting people who appreciate you for who you genuinely are, not for how much you're willing to sacrifice to keep them. That's where confidence begins. That's where freedom begins. And more often than not, that's where the healthiest relationships begin too. Thank you for watching. If this message resonated with you, let me know your biggest takeaway in the comments. And if you're committed to building genuine confidence, emotional discipline, and stronger relationships rooted in self-respect rather than fear, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.